In this unforgettable moment, late-night host Fiona Carrington, known for her sharp wit and unapologetic progressive views, takes aim at Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood. What starts as a comedic takedown quickly turns into a moment of profound reflection. As Fiona mocks Clint's old-school ideals and outspoken politics, the iconic actor surprises everyone with his calm, thoughtful responses. What follows is not just a battle of words, but a powerful exchange that leaves Fiona and the audience questioning their assumptions and beliefs. Don't miss the full story. Hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. Fiona Carrington was one of the most recognizable names in late-night television. Known for her unapologetic progressive views, sharp wit, and fearless commentary on both political figures and pop culture, she had carved out a unique space for herself in the media world. Her audience loved her bold approach, tuning in every night to see her tear apart her guests with biting sarcasm, often skewering their outdated beliefs and controversial stances. Fiona had made a career out of challenging the status quo, calling out celebrities, politicians, and cultural figures for their traditional, often conservative views. And it wasn't just that she found their opinions outdated. She saw them as a threat to the progressive ideals that she stood for. Her show was a platform for dismantling what she considered harmful ideologies, and every night, her fans reveled in watching her do so. It was during a regular production meeting that the idea of inviting Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, came up. There was a sudden buzz in the room, filled with excitement, but also skepticism. Clint, a man known for his roles in gritty dramas and iconic spaghetti westerns, was equally known for his outspoken conservative views. To many in Fiona's circle, he embodied everything they criticized: outdated masculinity, political conservatism, and a resistance to change. The idea of having Clint on the show didn't just excite Fiona, it thrilled her. This wasn't just an opportunity to boost ratings with a high-profile guest. To Fiona, this was a chance to expose Clint Eastwood for the embodiment of what she believed was wrong with the past. A showdown between the old guard and the progressive future she represented. The possibility of confronting him in front of a live audience had her giddy with anticipation. This was no ordinary interview. It was going to be a clash of ideologies, and she knew her audience would eat it up. With a smile curling at the corners of her mouth, Fiona dove headfirst into preparing for the interview. She wasn't just going to sit back and let Clint speak his piece. She was going to tear him apart, word by word, with her trademark mix of sarcasm, irony, and clever commentary. She watched clip after clip of Clint's old films, interviews, and speeches, scribbling notes in the margins, each line filled with biting critiques. The thought of taking down such a revered figure in front of millions of viewers fueled her excitement. She pictured the studio lights, the sharp delivery of her lines, and the roar of the audience as they cheered her on. This was going to be her moment. Fiona smirked at the thought of the coming confrontation. The contrast between her sharp, modern views and Clint's old-school stoic demeanor would be the heart of this battle. The words she had prepared were biting, but they weren't just meant to challenge Clint. They were meant to expose what Fiona saw as his outdated and dangerous ideas. This wasn't just an interview. It was a battle of ideologies, and Fiona couldn't wait to begin. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood sat at his ranch in Carmel, California, with the soft morning light streaming through the windows of his quiet kitchen. The calm, natural landscape outside his window seemed worlds away from the buzz of the city. As the sun rose over the rolling hills, Clint, at the age of 94, had lived a life full of both triumphs and struggles. His weathered face, marked by years of experience, carried the weight of time, but his eyes still shone with a quiet strength, a reminder of the man he had always been. His assistant, Jack, sat across the table, shuffling through papers nervously, waiting for a response. "Clint," Jack began, his voice cautious, "are you sure you want to do this?" Fiona Carrington is not exactly friendly territory. Clint paused, sipping his coffee as he stared out the window, his expression calm and unflinching. He was no stranger to tough conversations, having faced countless public challenges over his career. He slowly set his cup down, his gaze never leaving the window. "Friendly or not," he said in his gravelly voice, his lips curling into a faint smile. "A conversation's a conversation. People can say whatever they want, but it doesn't change the truth." Jack, though loyal and dedicated, had been following Fiona's career for years. He knew how merciless she could be with her guests, using sharp wit and pointed attacks to break them down. "She's going to come after you, you know," Jack warned. "She'll bring up your politics, your movies, probably even your age. She doesn't play nice." Clint's expression remained unchanged, as if Jack hadn't even spoken. He leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on the armrests with an easy, deliberate calm. His years of experience in the industry had taught him that some battles weren't worth fighting. "Let her," Clint said simply, his voice steady. "Sometimes it's not about winning or losing. It's about showing up." There was no trace of hesitation in Clint's voice. He'd been through far worse in his career. Criticism from all sides, doubts about his relevance, and the relentless demands of fame. But he'd never allowed that to shake him. In this moment, he wasn't intimidated. He was grounded, knowing that this interview wasn't a battle to be won, but a chance to stand by what he believed in. He placed the invitation on the table and, with a steady breath, looked out at the expansive landscape beyond, the sun beginning to rise higher in the sky. It was a reminder that, just like nature, time moved at its own pace, and the world didn't always have to be in a rush. "We'll see what happens," Clint muttered, more to himself than to Jack. Jack, who had been bracing for Clint's usual no-nonsense approach, could tell that the legendary actor was unfazed. He'd seen Clint fight for the things that mattered to him, but in this case, it seemed Clint wasn't interested in a fight. His calm acceptance of the situation showed just how much he'd changed over the years. Not that he had ever been a brash, hot-headed type, but Clint's weathered wisdom was now more profound than ever. While Fiona's team scrambled to prepare, crafting sharp, pointed questions to expose Clint's conservative views, Clint continued his daily routine, completely unfazed by the upcoming encounter. He didn't feel the need to rehearse or prepare snappy comebacks. He trusted in his instincts, his ability to stay true to who he was, and that was enough. He knew his worth didn't need to be proven, especially on national television. As he continued his quiet, peaceful life at the ranch, he felt a sense of calmness settling over him, one he had cultivated over decades of experience in the harsh spotlight of Hollywood. For Fiona, however, the days leading up to the show were a whirlwind of frantic preparation. Every question she would ask was meticulously crafted, with enough irony and humor to keep her audience laughing and her guest off balance. She pictured Clint's discomfort as she fired her pointed jabs, imagining his squirming as she tore into him, exposing the flaws of his political beliefs, his old-school masculinity, and his age. But Clint was unbothered. He trusted that whatever happened, he would handle it with the same quiet strength he had shown throughout his career. No matter how tough the interview might get, Clint Eastwood had learned long ago that the best way to handle life's challenges was to show up, be yourself, and let the chips fall where they may. As the night of the interview approached, Clint remained calm. He knew what awaited him, but he wasn't rattled. He simply leaned back in his chair and thought about the road that had brought him here. It wasn't about winning or losing this battle. It was about having the courage to speak the truth, even in the face of mockery, and trusting that his authenticity would speak louder than anything Fiona could throw at him. The day of the show finally arrived, and the energy in the studio was electric. As the stage lights began to warm up, there was a palpable hum in the air, a feeling of anticipation and excitement. Fiona Carrington, the star of the late-night talk show Late Night Spotlight, paced backstage, ready for the battle she had been preparing for. Her mind raced through the sharp lines she had crafted, rehearsing her opening monologue one last time in her head. Each word felt like a carefully sharpened sword, ready to cut deep. Fiona had a knack for turning every interview into a masterclass in wit, and tonight was no different. This wasn't going to be just another interview. This was going to be a showdown, an epic clash of ideologies. She pictured the studio lights gleaming down on Clint, imagining his discomfort as she fired off her clever digs. Her team buzzed around her, adjusting the microphones and lighting as they prepped for the live show. The room was filled with the rhythmic sounds of the crew moving quickly, their focus evident as they made final adjustments. The sense of excitement was palpable. After all, this would be an unforgettable episode. But Fiona wasn't just preparing for the usual banter. She had a higher goal in mind, one that went beyond entertainment. She wanted to dismantle Clint's outdated ideals. She had long criticized people like him, those who held on to old-fashioned values she thought no longer fit in today's world. Tonight, Fiona felt it was her duty to take down that wall of conservatism and bring the audience along for the ride. It wasn't just about exposing Clint's politics, movies, or age. It was about showing the world how far out of touch he was with the progressivism Fiona championed. As the live audience began to file in, Fiona stood tall, exuding the confidence of someone who knew she was in control. She felt at home here. This was her arena. The cameras, the studio lights, the eager faces in the audience, they all revolved around her. Tonight, she wasn't just playing for laughs. She was playing for something bigger. The crowd was ready for the entertainment, of course, but they had no idea they were about to witness an ideological duel. Fiona's eyes gleamed as she surveyed the room, her mind calculating the moment Clint would walk in, unaware of the storm she had prepared for him. Meanwhile, in the green room, Clint Eastwood was preparing in his own way. He was sitting calmly, sipping on a bottle of water, his posture relaxed as he exchanged a few polite nods with the crew. The noise of the busy studio faded into the background for him. Unlike Fiona, Clint wasn't frantic. He wasn't rehearsing his responses or scrambling to remember his lines. There was no tension in the air for him. Clint had faced down much larger challenges in his career. He had been through the storm of public opinion, had faced the scorn of critics, and had dealt with the pressure of being a public figure for decades. He wasn't going to let a late-night host throw him off. Clint trusted his instincts. His confidence wasn't in memorizing answers or retorts. It was in the certainty that he could handle whatever Fiona threw his way. It wasn't about pretense or performance. It was about being himself. For Fiona, this moment was all about sharp repartee. She had built a career out of outwitting her guests, using sarcasm and quick jabs to leave them flustered and exposed. She imagined the rush she would feel as the audience laughed at every barb she delivered. This was the kind of interview she was born to conduct. She was ready for it to be a spectacle. But unbeknownst to her, Clint wasn't playing by the same rules. His calm presence, his stoic demeanor, and his ability to speak directly from the heart were about to challenge everything Fiona expected from the night. What Fiona didn't realize was that tonight wasn't just going to be about tearing Clint down. It would be about Clint offering a perspective that might never have been heard on her show before. He was a man with years of experience, shaped by a Hollywood that had changed beyond recognition, a man who had learned the power of authenticity and standing by his principles. His quiet wisdom, built on a foundation of integrity and self-reflection, was about to turn the tables on her. Neither Fiona nor Clint could predict how the night would unfold or the impact it would have. What started as a carefully orchestrated encounter, meant to expose Clint's old-school ideas, would soon evolve into something far deeper than either of them could have imagined. Fiona thought she had the upper hand, but Clint's calm composure was about to shift the dynamic in ways she hadn't prepared for. The stage was set, but the conversation was about to take a turn no one, including Fiona, had anticipated. The studio lights burned brightly above the stage, as the audience buzzed with excitement. You could feel the tension building in the air as Fiona Carrington took her seat behind the desk. Her heart raced with anticipation, but she hid it well beneath her cool demeanor. The crowd settled into their seats, their faces eager, waiting for the verbal showdown they had been promised. Fiona's smile was sharp as she looked out over the audience. Tonight was her night, and she was ready to own the stage. The cameras rolled, and Fiona's voice rang out across the studio, full of biting sarcasm and sharp irony. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a legend in the house tonight. Clint Eastwood, an icon of Hollywood, a symbol of old-school masculinity, and a man who still thinks talking to an empty chair is good entertainment." The moment the words left her lips, the audience erupted into laughter, many clapping and hooting in appreciation of the jab. Fiona leaned back slightly, savoring the moment. She was in control. She could feel it. She had the audience in the palm of her hand, and with Clint sitting across from her, she was ready to strike again. Her nerves, if they existed, were well hidden beneath her confident exterior. As Clint sat across from her, his posture was relaxed, almost too calm in the face of her fiery words. His hands rested lightly on the arms of the chair, his face impassive, but his eyes were alert, watching her every move. He wasn't rattled by her opening salvo. In fact, he didn't seem to be fazed at all. There was a quiet strength about him, an almost unshakable calm that, to Fiona's surprise, only fueled her desire to push harder. Fiona leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on her desk, her gaze focused intently on Clint. This was her turf, and she intended to dominate. The night was supposed to be hers to steer, to dissect Clint Eastwood's outdated views and expose them for the audience to see. It was supposed to be a takedown, a moment of triumph. But as she took in Clint's unyielding calmness, she could already sense a shift. He wasn't the easy target she had imagined. With the crowd's laughter still echoing in her ears, Fiona launched her first real question. It was a sharp one, aimed directly at the heart of Clint's values. "Do you ever feel like those old-school values you portrayed in your films don't hold up anymore?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. The audience responded immediately, laughter rippling through the room at Fiona's pointed attack. They were eating it up. Fiona felt the momentum shifting in her favor, and she could almost taste the satisfaction of taking down this Hollywood icon with a well-placed barb. She expected Clint to stumble, to fumble for words, to get defensive. After all, that's what she was used to. She had seen it 1,000 times before. But Clint was different. He sat back slightly in his chair, unfazed by the barrage. His eyes remained steady on her, not angry or defensive, but calm, even thoughtful. He exhaled slowly, almost like he wasn't hearing her for the first time, but instead taking in her words, considering them carefully. He wasn't rattled. "I think it's important to remember," Clint began, his voice low but steady, "that films are a reflection of their time. They capture what people were thinking, feeling, and struggling with. Sure, some of it doesn't age well, but that's true of anything. Things move forward, and some might say you're clinging to the past. But I think it's important to stay grounded too." The response was measured, simple, and powerful, without a hint of defensiveness. It stopped Fiona in her tracks. The audience had expected more laughter, more biting sarcasm, but instead, Clint's words hung in the air, steady and sure. The room fell quiet, as if waiting for Fiona's next move. The crowd had been primed for another round of humor, but Clint had given them something else, something deeper. Fiona, caught off guard for the first time in years, faltered. Her usual sharpness was momentarily dulled by the clarity in Clint's response. She hadn't prepared for this kind of encounter. This wasn't just an ideological battle. This was a conversation, one that was unfolding in real time and catching Fiona off guard. She quickly recovered, but the brief moment of hesitation spoke volumes. The energy in the room had shifted slightly, and Fiona could feel it. This wasn't going to be as easy as she thought, Clint leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture as relaxed as ever, his eyes never leaving Fiona as she tried to maneuver through her line of questioning. He didn't flinch. His response was calm, measured, and full of experience. "Films are a reflection of their time," he explained, his voice steady, carrying a certain wisdom that came from years of working in Hollywood. "They capture what people were thinking, feeling, and struggling with. Sure, some of it doesn't age well, but that's true of anything. Things move forward, and some might say you're clinging to the past." There was no anger in his words, no defensiveness, just a quiet certainty that seemed to settle in the room like a heavy blanket. Clint wasn't justifying, he was explaining, and it wasn't the type of explanation anyone could easily argue with. The simplicity of it hit home. For a moment, the laughter that had accompanied Fiona's earlier jabs died down, and the room fell into a thoughtful silence. Fiona, ever the master of witty comebacks, paused. She wasn't prepared for this. This wasn't the Clint she had envisioned. He wasn't fighting back with sarcasm or trying to outwit her. He wasn't rattled. Instead, Clint's calm conviction made her question whether she had misjudged him. He wasn't just an actor from a bygone era. He was speaking with a depth that made Fiona pause for the first time. Clint, noticing the shift in the atmosphere, let out a soft chuckle, his eyes twinkling with a hint of humor that made Fiona feel, for the first time, like she had underestimated him. "You call it clinging. I call it staying grounded," he continued, his tone light but profound. "The world moves fast, Fiona, but sometimes in its rush to change, it forgets the value of what came before." The simplicity of that statement seemed to echo in the studio, reverberating through the room. The audience, which had been laughing along with Fiona's biting sarcasm just moments ago, seemed to pause, their attention fixed on Clint's words. His voice didn't carry the sharp edge of anger, but instead the deep tone of someone who had lived through many changes, who had seen the ebb and flow of trends and ideas. It was a truth that resonated on a deeper level, something beyond politics or pop culture. Fiona was momentarily thrown off balance. She had expected more deflection, more of the typical Hollywood arrogance she was used to. But this was different. Clint wasn't just reacting. He was speaking from a place of deep understanding. She faltered, her usual sharp retorts vanishing as the weight of his words hung in the air. The energy in the room shifted, and she could feel the audience begin to lean into Clint's perspective. Her confidence, once unwavering, was now tinged with uncertainty. How could she respond to this? She quickly masked it with a playful shrug and a forced smile, but there was a crack in her facade. "Fair enough," she said, her tone lighter now, attempting to regain control. But the words came out more as a concession than a comeback. She wasn't quite sure how to respond to someone who, instead of becoming defensive, had just calmly presented a perspective that forced her to think. It was clear now that this wasn't going to be the one-sided exchange she had expected. The audience, too, seemed to feel the shift. The energy in the studio had changed from the excitement of a typical late-night show to a more subdued, reflective atmosphere. The usual laughs and cheers had quieted, and even the crew backstage had stopped to listen. It was as if Clint had not only answered Fiona's question, but had posed a question of his own. What happens when progress is so fast that it forgets to look back and consider the value of the past? Fiona, for the first time in the interview, wasn't sure how to steer the conversation next. It had become clear to her that this wasn't just about a witty exchange. It was about something deeper. A conversation was unfolding, one that neither of them could have anticipated. As the conversation continued, Fiona's resolve to challenge Clint remained strong. With a raised brow, she dove into another line of questioning, this time accusing him of perpetuating what some referred to as toxic masculinity in his early films. She hoped the words would sting, that they would provoke a reaction from Clint that could help her regain the upper hand. But Clint, ever the steady presence, didn't flinch. He leaned forward just a bit, his hands now resting on the desk, and looked her square in the eye as he calmly responded. "Violence is a part of life. Always has been," Clint said, his voice unshaken and sure. But those stories weren't about glorifying violence. They were about confronting it. They were about characters who had to make hard choices in a tough world. There was a quiet power in his words, and the room seemed to feel it. The sharp criticism that had been aimed at him now hung in the air, dissipating, as Clint's calm demeanor shifted the dynamic. His voice carried a weight that spoke of years spent in the industry, years spent reflecting on the stories he told and the lessons they carried. The audience, once easily swept up in Fiona's pointed attacks, began to listen more intently. The initial laughter that had accompanied her jabs faded into thoughtful silence. Clint wasn't defending violence. He was speaking to the complexity of life itself. And with that, something in the room shifted. Fiona, sensing the change, leaned in a bit closer, her usual edge softening. She'd expected Clint to become defensive or angry, but he was giving her something different, something real. For the first time that night, Fiona found herself at a loss for words. There was no sharp retort. She paused, reconsidering her next question. She wasn't fighting him anymore. She was listening. "So," she asked, her voice more measured than before. "So, do you believe we need to evolve and let go of some of those old ideals?" She was reaching, trying to steer the conversation in a direction where she could still assert her position. Clint's answer came, simple but profound, his voice low and steady. "Evolution doesn't mean abandoning your roots," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "It means understanding them." The room fell silent. The weight of Clint's words settled into the space, and the audience seemed to reflect on them, some nodding quietly in agreement. Fiona, who had been so eager to challenge him, was now faced with the quiet reality of his perspective. It wasn't about rejecting the past. It was about building on it. His simple truth was one that lingered, making her reconsider her approach, her questions, and even the very premise of the interview. Then Clint began to speak of something more personal, something that transcended the world of film and politics. He began to talk about his struggles in Hollywood, about the early years of rejection, and the doubt that constantly loomed over him. His tone softened, and he spoke with a clarity that could only come from someone who had lived through hardship and emerged stronger. "I could have quit," he said, his gaze steady as it met Fiona's. "Most people would have, but I didn't. Not because I thought I'd make it big, but because something inside me told me to keep going." The audience was dead silent now, hanging on his every word. The shift in tone from the earlier, more combative questions was palpable. This wasn't just about politics or film anymore. This was about real life, about resilience, grit, and the power of perseverance. Clint wasn't just sharing a story. He was sharing a part of his soul. His words resonated, not just in the studio, but in every person who listened closely enough to feel the truth in them. Fiona, ever the sharp-witted host, found herself unexpectedly moved. Her usual sharpness, honed over years of interviewing and dissecting her guests, softened. It wasn't that she was conceding defeat. It was that Clint's sincerity had cut through her armor, exposing something deeper. She saw him not as the Hollywood legend to be taken down, but as a man who had lived through struggles and emerged with wisdom. Clint's story wasn't just about Hollywood's glitz and glamour. It was about the quiet, persistent struggle to stay true to yourself, despite the odds stacked against you. And in that moment, Fiona realized that Clint Eastwood's journey wasn't just his own. It was a reflection of something universal, something everyone could relate to, whether they had grown up on his films or not. The real story here wasn't about clashing ideologies. It was about the quiet strength of perseverance and the power of staying true to one's values. And for the first time, Fiona began to see the man in front of her, not as a target for ridicule, but as someone whose life lessons could teach her and the audience something far greater than any punchline. As Clint finished his heartfelt recounting of his struggles and triumphs in Hollywood, Fiona, for the first time that night, felt a flicker of uncertainty. She had come into this interview with one mission: to challenge Clint, to pick apart his beliefs, and to expose what she considered flaws in his outdated worldview. But Clint had done something she hadn't expected. He had shifted the entire conversation. What started as a sharp verbal duel had morphed into a deeper, more reflective discussion about resilience, integrity, and the importance of staying true to oneself. Fiona had planned her questions carefully, each one designed to catch him off guard, to make him uncomfortable. She expected him to buckle under the pressure, to respond with defensiveness or anger. But instead, Clint had calmly, thoughtfully deflected each jab with a wisdom that left her grappling for a response. His quiet conviction had rendered her own sharp remarks irrelevant. And in that moment, Fiona began to realize that the battle of ideologies she had envisioned wasn't going to unfold the way she'd expected. Sensing that she had reached a turning point, Fiona took a deep breath and changed the tone of the conversation. Her voice softened as she asked Clint, "What about strength? How do you find it when everything seems like it's falling apart?" She needed to know, needed to understand how Clint was able to push through the hardest of times. His answer, simple and direct, struck her in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Strength comes from knowing your purpose," Clint said, his voice steady. "Knowing why you're doing what you're doing. If you don't know your why, resilience is a lot harder to find." Fiona looked out at the audience, and it was then that she saw it. The subtle shift in their energy. The usual buzz of mockery, the laughter that had followed her sharp remarks, had all but faded away. Instead, the room was filled with a quieter energy, one of reflection, of deep thought. The crowd, who had been eager to join in on Fiona's critiques, now seemed to be listening intently, taking Clint's words to heart. His perspective was resonating with them. They weren't just hearing a Hollywood legend speak. They were hearing someone who had lived a full, complicated life and learned from it. Even Fiona herself found herself grappling with the truth of what Clint had just said. She could feel the weight of his words settling in her own chest. She had spent so much of her career focused on exposing flaws, challenging ideas, and being right. But now, Clint's steady conviction and his unwavering belief in the importance of knowing one's purpose made her question everything she had thought she understood about resilience. She had spent years tearing others down with her quick wit. But in that moment, Fiona realized that Clint's quiet strength wasn't something she could easily dismiss. It was something that demanded her attention. Her usual sharpness, the sarcasm that had always been her armor, began to feel like it no longer served her. For the first time that night, Fiona wasn't looking to tear Clint down. She was listening, truly listening. And in that moment, she realized that the greatest lesson she could learn wasn't about winning or losing the debate. It was about learning to understand the deeper truths in the conversations we have, even when they don't go the way we expect. As Clint spoke, his words seemed to hang in the air, each sentence slowly sinking into the hearts of those listening. His voice, steady and calm, reverberated with sincerity, and Fiona, who had once dominated the conversation with her sharp wit and biting sarcasm, found herself caught in the quiet power of his wisdom. She had come into this interview with the intention of exposing Clint, of challenging his views. But now, as his stories of perseverance and resilience filled the room, she began to see him in a different light. Fiona leaned forward, no longer with the intention to strike, but with genuine curiosity. The walls she had built up throughout the interview were crumbling, and for the first time that night, she was truly listening to what Clint had to say. It was clear that this wasn't just another battle of ideas. This was a conversation that was challenging her own beliefs and making her question the way she had approached her career, her ideals, and even her purpose. With a newfound sense of respect, Fiona asked him, her voice softer than before, How do you keep going when everything feels like it's against you? It was a question that had been lingering in her mind throughout the interview. Clint's answer came without hesitation, his words as simple as they were profound. You keep going because you have to. You don't let the world drown you out. The impact of his words was immediate. The audience, who had been ready to mock Clint, now sat in stunned silence. Slowly, however, the silence turned into applause. It wasn't the raucous, performance-driven applause that had greeted Fiona's opening remarks. No, this was something different, something more genuine. It was as though the entire room had shifted, and the applause wasn't just for Clint's words, but for the authenticity that had filled the space. Fiona, taken aback by the shift, looked around the room, her usual bravado replaced by a newfound respect for Clint's steady resolve. She had spent years priding herself on being able to take down anyone who dared to sit across from her. But Clint's words had made her realize that it wasn't about being right or tearing someone down. It was about finding strength in your own convictions and listening to others with an open heart. Her tone, once sharp and pointed, now softened as she admitted, "You've given me a lot to think about, Clint." She paused for a moment, reflecting on how her approach to conversations and even her career had been built on the foundation of winning, of proving a point, of making sure her voice was the loudest. And now, Clint had shown her that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen, not just to respond, but to understand. The audience, now fully engaged, nodded in agreement. Fiona could feel the room's energy change again. This time, the focus was on Clint's wisdom and the raw honesty with which he spoke. It wasn't about a winner or loser anymore. It was about a deeper connection that transcended the usual back and forth of talk show banter. The lesson of the night was clear. Sometimes, the most profound moments come not from the loudest voices, but from those who speak with purpose and integrity. And for Fiona, that realization would stay with her long after the cameras stopped rolling. As the show wrapped up, a quiet but powerful shift was evident. The applause that had followed Clint's last words wasn't the usual kind. There was no loud cheering or rowdy excitement. Instead, it was a subdued, heartfelt response that seemed to reverberate through the studio. As the crew broke for a commercial, the studio lights dimmed, and the buzz of activity seemed to fade into the background. Fiona, sitting backstage in her dressing room, couldn't help but replay the conversation in her mind. She had gone into the interview expecting to have the upper hand, to maintain control of the narrative. But what had unfolded was something entirely different. A moment of reflection, not just for the audience, but for her too. Her producer Veronica had already noticed the shift. "Did you see the reaction from the crowd?" Veronica asked, her voice carrying a mix of surprise and admiration. "This is unlike anything we've ever had." Fiona leaned back in her chair, still processing the unexpected turn the evening had taken. It wasn't the usual comedic spectacle she had prepared for, nor was it the takedown she had envisioned. Instead, it was something far deeper, something that touched a nerve in a way that her sharp-tongued commentary never could. The interview had started as a verbal duel, but by the end, it had transformed into something profoundly moving. She hadn't anticipated the shift, but in hindsight, she knew it was a moment that she and her audience would remember for a long time. Back in the studio, the crew was scrambling to adjust to the change in atmosphere. Normally, there would be chatter about the show, behind-the-scenes jokes, and discussions about the next big segment. But tonight, the usual post-show buzz was different. The reactions from the audience were still hanging in the air, and even the crew seemed quieter, reflecting on the depth of the conversation. Meanwhile, online, things were starting to heat up. The usual frenzy of social media, which would typically flood with memes or cutting comments after one of Fiona's interviews, had shifted dramatically. Instead, the internet was alive with conversations about Clint's words. Clips of his calm but resolute monologue spread quickly, resonating with people from all walks of life. The hashtag #Clint Eastwood Wisdom trended across platforms, with people from different political backgrounds and generations sharing how his words on integrity and resilience had struck a chord with them. It wasn't long before think pieces and social media posts poured in, all reflecting on the same thing. Clint Eastwood had delivered a rare moment of authenticity. The responses ranged from admiration for Clint's integrity to surprise at how the interview had unfolded. The usual snark that Fiona's interviews were known for was nowhere to be found. Instead, the conversation was about the substance of Clint's message, a message that went beyond political differences and touched on the universal values of standing by one's beliefs and having the strength to keep going in the face of adversity. Fiona, scrolling through her phone in the quiet of her dressing room, could feel the weight of the moment. She had seen the reactions, the comments from viewers who had praised Clint for his wisdom, who had applauded his calm in the face of her sharp attacks. It was strange, almost surreal. She had expected to dominate, to expose Clint's views, and make him the butt of jokes. But what had happened instead was that Clint had won, not by overpowering her with words, but by speaking truthfully from his heart. As she read through the comments, Fiona couldn't deny that Clint's message had reached her too. For the first time in her career, she had been forced to confront her own approach to interviews. Was she simply out to prove her superiority, to win the battle of words? Or was there room for more depth, more meaning in the conversations she had on her show? She hadn't expected to leave the interview feeling changed, but Clint had done just that. Her mind raced as she thought about the impact of the interview, the way Clint's calm demeanor had shifted the room, and the way his words had resonated so deeply with the audience, including herself. She leaned back in her chair and sighed, realizing that this episode, though different from her usual style, was one of the most meaningful ones she had ever been a part of. The aftershocks of Clint's interview rippled far beyond the studio. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed out, the conversation that had just taken place began to reverberate across the country. People from all walks of life, from small towns to big cities, from every corner of the political spectrum, started discussing Clint's words. What started as an anticipated clash between an outspoken progressive host and a legendary actor had transformed into something far more impactful. Clint had shared not just his thoughts on film or politics, but on life itself, on the importance of resilience, staying true to yourself, and not being swayed by the noise of the world. In households across the nation, people replayed his monologue, absorbing the simple yet powerful truths he had spoken. Workers at a factory discussed his perspective on handling adversity with grace during their lunch break. In boardrooms, entrepreneurs who had struggled with setbacks saw themselves in Clint's story of perseverance. Even students in classrooms found themselves reflecting on what he had said, particularly his thoughts on integrity and staying grounded in an ever-changing world. On social media, the response was overwhelming. The typical firestorms of criticism and praise had given way to a more subdued, thoughtful dialogue. People from opposite sides of the political spectrum found common ground in Clint's message of honesty, authenticity, and the importance of not losing yourself in the rush to fit in or please others. Hashtags like Clint Eastwood Wisdom and Integrity Matters trended across multiple platforms as individuals shared their own stories of how they had struggled with their beliefs or questioned their choices. Clint's words had struck a chord that went deeper than any political debate or viral meme. As Clint left the studio, there was no dramatic fanfare or flashy send-off. His exit was quiet, almost reflective. He didn't need any grand gestures. The weight of the moment was already felt. Outside, his assistant Jack was waiting by the car. Clint gave him a faint smile as he climbed into the passenger seat. "It's not about handling things," Clint said, almost as though he was speaking to himself. "It's about being yourself. The rest takes care of itself." His words, simple but profound, seemed to hang in the air as the car rolled down the quiet street. The usual rush of adrenaline that came after a show, whether positive or negative, was absent. Clint didn't feel the need for validation. He had spoken his truth, and that was enough. It wasn't about winning the argument, proving a point, or scoring a victory. It was about remaining true to who he was, no matter the challenges, the doubts, or the noise. As the city lights flashed past, Clint gazed out the window, his calm demeanor betraying nothing more than quiet contentment. The world could say what it wanted, but he had already shared what mattered most: his truth. Back in the studio, Fiona Carrington, sitting backstage with her team, could feel the weight of Clint's words lingering long after the cameras stopped rolling. She realized, in that moment, that this had been far more than an interview. It had been a lesson in humility, resilience, and the power of listening. The impact of Clint's wisdom was not confined to the studio or the viral moments online. It had seeped into the hearts and minds of those who had heard it. As Fiona prepared to move on to the next segment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just in her, but in the entire atmosphere of the show. She had been expecting a fiery showdown, but instead, Clint had given her, and everyone watching, a rare, honest glimpse into what it truly meant to stand firm in your beliefs, regardless of the world around you.